Hello and welcome, everybody. We've had a very busy week. We were at the Festival of Politics at Holyrood. It was a fabulous event, wasn't it?
It was. Yeah, it was. It really was. I mean, well, it was Fiona who had been looking at the programme and realised that Professor Danny Dorling was coming up. I'm so pleased he did, because it was just such an enjoyable outing in itself, because of course we stayed on afterwards and had lunch in the Parliament Cafe. But the actual event itself was brilliant, and we're fans of Danny Dorling, because we know that he's spoken out about how life-changing the Scottish Child Payment is proving, and he's also spoken out about it's an amazing bit of legislation that's been put through, and how even more amazing is that the British media don't talk about it. So we go, yeah, well, we're used to that, actually, but maybe he's not. He's a professor down at Oxford, professor of human geography, loads and loads of books.
How lovely was it to be back in Holyrood? I mean, this is the fourth time now we've been in the building, not just standing at the front. Every time it's just, I come away feeling this is ours, it's such a lovely building.
Yeah, and so, indeed. I just so agree with that. And I think this time coming in, I was just really aware of you and I's response to being in the European Parliament over in Brussels when we were there earlier this year, and what a wonderful building, but more what a wonderful space it is. Now, obviously, the European Parliament is a much bigger building than Holyrood, but there's something the same. You go into Holyrood and there's just different spaces, and you can sit down, you can have a chat. There's obviously, behind the public bit of it, there's all sorts of rooms where people can have meetings and everything, but yeah, it's friendly, and I felt the same as you. Oh, it's back in our Parliament. Great.
Rather than just being in a side room, we were actually in the debating chamber for the event, which was fabulous. And we had a moral choice to make, didn't we?
Yeah, we did.
Where were we going to
sit?
We did sacrifice our principles, sat in the Tory front benches, but we got a great view of Danny, and it was a really interesting talk. There was so many interesting topics, and what happened was Danny spoke for a while. Liam MacArthur asked him a couple of questions, and then there were questions from the audience, and the audience included school kids, it included a range of people, different ages. It was really, and it was full. It was very busy.
It was. I suspect, you get the impression anyway, his politics are a very good fit with mine and what I would like things to happen in the country. But he's got all the data behind him to be able to kind of, bring it forward and back it up. But it was great.
The first one that really struck me was when he was talking about how strongly, and you can argue about how strong this is, and it's not, universal, but very often how your life circumstances are going to dictate your outcomes. It's going to dictate your achievement in life, your life expectancy, your susceptibility to drink and drugs and things. In fact, let's hear him say it, because it's better than me saying it.
Now, if you imagine with this chamber, if we were to take you lot, who are all sitting there quite anonymously now, and move you around so that we take the spread of you from here to here, and those of you from the most affluent families end up sitting here, and we sort you out, and then we talk about what's likely to happen to you in a future Scotland if things don't change. And so we've put those of you from the poorest backgrounds down here. Now, you can typify the stories that'll be here: more chance of drug addiction, more chance of not having enough food, more chance of not being able to have holidays ever. But up here, where we're going to take the people who are most privileged in this audience, you lot are going to be frightened. You lot will be frightened that you're going to lose this, that the rest of you are going to come for your money, for your wealth, bring in a wealth tax, that you might not succeed, that you might not get to, I don't know, St Andrews, Edinburgh, whatever you have to do. Because if you're here, you have to go to an elite. We'd be thankful, because it's now an elite Scottish university. Right? Young people from Scotland do not come down to England anymore, for obvious reason. But you have to go to an elite university, so your freedom is curtailed here. You can't just go and work at 18, which might be more interesting, because you might be sick of school. And then you've got to meet and marry the right person, and you've got to have a successful career.
I don't disagree. I don't disagree with what you said, but I disagree with it a little bit. And I think it's interesting that I just have reservations, and I think what's happening right this minute is I'm kind of rationalizing it and what I'm about to say, which is that maybe that's more true in a big city. That there's those sort of restrictions on what people's lives are going to, how that will unfold or not unfold. And then maybe it's a bit different in a smaller town, country town, which is like the one that I grew up in Cooper, because I didn't have any of that. I didn't pick up any of that. But when I came through to Edinburgh, by which time I was at university, I really noticed that the people who had grown up and gone to school in Edinburgh were very, very aware of what school you'd gone to. And that was one of the first questions you got. I don't know, I don't quite do that. But maybe it's the background and the generation and what your mum and dad said to you. My mum and dad always said, look, whatever you want to do, have a go for it. I guess maybe it won't work, but try. So different, isn't it?
I think as well, though, he's dealing in terms of statistics. So
he is.
There's always going to be exceptions.
That's true.
But even if there's a generality that, if you're brought up in, I don't know, Castle Milk or something, you have a certain, the chances are you're going to have a certain future. Whereas if you're brought up in Milgai, the chances are it'll be a different future. So, generalizations. But
it is, that's true. And he does, to be fair, he says that at the beginning. It's a generalization. Yeah. Yeah, but it's quite stark, isn't it? And it is true, because although I had that bit of a personal reservation about it, actually, thinking about Glasgow, Bearsden abuts directly onto Drumchapel, one of the big housing schemes that got set up in Glasgow after the war. And I mean, there are statistics there. Life expectancy in the Bearsden bit is, several years more than it is in general in the Drumchapel bit.
Absolutely.
I mean, the thing that I did find out afterwards is that Danny's written a book called All That Is Solid. The front cover has a brick on it, and it's about what he calls the great housing disaster defines our times and what we can do about it. But I'm pretty certain that's going to be a reference to how Mrs. Thatcher let people buy their council houses. Wow. But I think it's also a reference to rent and house landlords, and where money, people have to put a large proportion of their income into the rent. That means they're not spending it on other things. That affects the economy. I'm sure it's a pretty wide-ranging, set of reflections. So there's a copy in Glasgow Library, so I've just reserved it for myself.
Well, you can do a critique of it for us after you've read it.
Well, at least I'll do a blog post.
Do a blog post, yeah.
Yep.
The next one that got me, he talked a little bit about how, I think the question was about how can we get people more interested in the climate emergency? And he had said, well, people get fed up of hearing scare stories, and it's maybe not as uppermost in their minds as things that are more immediate, like the cost of living and housing and unemployment, which is huge. Even though we've got generally low unemployment, people are frightened of that. And then the bit he came onto, which I'll play next, is how politicians use this because it's easy to scare people.
Who's going to want me? Who's going to give me a job? What am I going to get in future? And realising that that's such a big fear in people helps partly explain why something like climate isn't seen as important, but also how easy it is to scare people about these other people who are going to come and take your jobs or do these terrible things. You might think, how on earth do they manage to scare people about the nice people who come to our countries to live with us, which we should be very grateful for. I may sound sceptical. Remember, I said I grew up in a family in the 70s with 2 black brothers. I find it very hard to be tolerant of people not liking people from outside. How do we manage to get people so scared about immigration? Because so many of us are scared about our own future, and are we needed? Will we be able to put our children into school? Will we be able to see the doctor or go to hospital? Will you be able to get a house? And what's the threat to that? And so I think it's really important to look at attitudes and fears, because if you don't address cost of living crisis and you don't address the fear of unemployment, then people will use that to rise up in your mind what they want you to be frightened about, partly because they don't want you to worry about that inequality I've talked about, because some of them think that inequality is a really, really good thing, because they tend to think that they're much cleverer than you and they should decide what happens and you should just let them be in charge. And a very trivial description of politics in the UK, but it's one of our fundamental divisions in the UK, is those politicians who think that a tiny number of people are clever, tended to have gone to exclusive schools, tended never to have mixed with other people, and those politicians who've got more faith in people more generally. And that's a fundamental political divide between right and left.
So that was quite interesting in that you can see it unfolding in front of us.
Yeah, it's a bit. I always find it chilling, actually, because as you say, it is unfolding. I mean, literally, it's unfolding down in, was it Essex, down in that part of England, where a lot of very extreme right-wing, anti-immigrant. Well, I mean, anti-immigrant is being kind to them, racist, really. And behind that, there's people setting those, stirring that up.
Yeah.
And then the council goes to court to say we want to not use that hotel, and then somehow or other they've won. And then now all sorts of other councils are saying, oh, well, we're going to do that too. And Kemi Badenoch saying, yeah, you should also go to court and we should stop using all these hotels. Now, I'm not saying there is an argument about using hotels like that. And actually you can sympathise if it's been going on for months and months and it's a small place. But what's needed, you can sympathise with people going, oh, what is it that's going on and who's there? But what you need is transparency and communication and sitting down and talking to each other, not mobs with, well, sometimes it's English flags, but usually it's Union Jacks out there, stirring themselves up and probably frightening the folk who's inside the hotel.
Yeah,
it's horrible.
And it pits communities against each other. I mean, the reality is neither of them should be struggling for somewhere decent to live. But it's not each other's fault that they're in that situation, but it is that stirring the pot. And we saw it in Falkirk just last week.
It's hard, and it's when there's a momentum builds up, isn't it? And you can see it happening actually this very week with this sort of thing. So momentum builds up, and once the momentum builds up, it's really difficult to kind of step back and have a proper conversation about it or explore other options. It's also, at the moment, it's a bit of a copycat. I mean, it's on a much smaller scale, but it's copycat of what's happening in America. Trump goes on TV and says, they're eating the cats and dogs, they're eating your pets. It's just so deliberate and so cynical. And as Danny Dorling said, it's because they certainly don't want ordinary people to feel that they've got power over, a political direction of the country. They want it left in their own hands. They just want to distract.
It is a distraction. That's it. A complete distraction from the people who are benefiting from the way the country is just now and are reaping in X amount of money. Yeah. The next one, the conversation went on to child poverty, and he did make the what should be the obvious response to child poverty is, well, if people are in poverty, give them some more money in the short term, if there might be other long-term solutions. But he also, though, this is the bit where he was asked about the Scottish child payment.
And to sit down in England, looking at other countries in Europe and what they do, the lowest child poverty rate was in Norway, less than 10%. And then to suddenly see during the pandemic, a country introduce a payment. I think it was £10 a week for children under 6 originally. And then increase that payment to all children in families receiving any kind of benefit. And there's argument of, heads around about £30. £4,000 for a family of 3, in effect. Funding that payment out of a slightly greater redistribution in the UK as a whole, but massively less than Germany, France and Spain or any normal European country. You know, don't think it's that progressive in Scotland. You're just better than England. But stunning. And now we are beginning to measure the effects and to see the effects. And we shouldn't have to do this. But the height differences you can see there in the surveys. It's an incredible thing. Or, as I said before, it's not reported in the press in London. So when I do talks in the South for the last few years, invariably, I've talked about our child poverty rates. I've talked about how many children have no holiday, don't do this, go hungry. How many babies have never been washed in warm water in Oxford? Because once you can't turn on the heat anymore, and a baby never gets used to being washed in cold water. This is Oxford. And I say, what can you do? And I say, there's a country in Europe which has done this. And I describe the scheme, and I get the audience to guess. And it always takes them more than 10 countries before they realise it's Scotland. And then my kind of punchline or joke is, but, you know, obviously that's such a different country and they speak a different language and they've got a different culture, and we couldn't possibly do what they do in Scotland here, could we? Yeah, sorry, it's an incredible thing. And I'm English and I'm out of it, and we're in the Parliament, but I'm not involved in Scottish politics. But I'm sure there's been an enormous amount of quiet talking to each other amongst MSPs about, I don't like this, I do like this, but and at the moment, it seems to me it's still off the table and accepted that even as the number of children in Scotland still goes down, because like everywhere else, you're having less of them, that's why it gets cheaper, that this is not something which is debated as, shall we let them go hungry or not? Right. And I think it's very, very impressive. I really worry about how much it's hated in London.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it? This is a bit of an aside, but I mean, he's very good. I mean, obviously, professionally, he's engaging with statistics. So you were saying earlier, it's about statistics, but he's also very good at just bringing in just a human example of it, like the one about
the baby and the cold
babies
water.
And the cold water, and you think, oh, well, yeah, if you can't afford to put the heating on,
yeah,
and he's very, very good at doing that. I think he does it in a quite measured way. Actually, at the very beginning of the talk, do you remember he said, I could be telling you examples of this and it would horrify you. I'm not going to do that. But at the same time, there's some other examples that he brings in. So he's treading a line between the statistics and what he knows about actually how that pans out in effect, actually.
And didn't he have a great phrase? It was statistics portrays emotion, but with the tears wiped away. Yes. So it's a way of portraying the situation while not having that emotional connection. But then he's added it in by the way he's described it.
By the way he describes it, yes. That was, I mean, it's quite something, isn't it? You know, he's down south and he says, which country do you think does that? And it takes him 10 goes before someone says Scotland.
He also gave the example that the other thing that they don't talk about in London, and they don't want any coverage of, is expulsions and suspensions from school. Now, that was something I didn't realise, that we were different to England. But he gave, I think he said 11% of children have been expelled, which seems phenomenally high, although not necessarily expelled forever. But
so is it that it's not allowed to happen here?
I don't think it's as easy for it to happen. I think there was some debate. This is something the Tories periodically complain about, you know, our education. How are you going to discipline these children if you can't exclude them? But I think there was a presumption that you won't exclude children. You'll find a better solution.
Yeah, maybe we should try and find out a bit about that.
We could. And I think it's quite recent as well. I think it's in the work Jenny Gilruth has been doing, and about violence in schools as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, going back to the child poverty, I mean, you know, because sometimes I think, well, why is it that it's always framed as child poverty? Because really it's family poverty, isn't it? And if you talk about family poverty, then that opens up immediately things that you'll start thinking about that you might not if it's more closely focused or seems to be on child poverty. But I did a bit of reading around it, and apparently one of the reasons is that there's a lot of statistics about child poverty. So that's where someone like him, and politicians, I'm sure, that's where they go to for their background information. There's not quite the same amount on the broader aspects of family poverty and what's behind that. Although it's not difficult to come up with likely guesses as to what's behind the family poverty.
I think I have got a clip on that point. Let's try this one.
You always use children as the argument about inequality because it's easiest, right? Almost nobody blames a child aged 5 for the situation they find themselves in. Nobody says, "Oh, couldn't they have tried a bit harder when they were 4? Persuaded their parents, okay." So child poverty is politically easy. Politically easy. You've got to be a bit nasty to think it's okay for children to be poor. And the tragedy is there are some people who do think that. And whole countries are affected. Your standard poverty survey across Europe is you ask people, should children have a spare pair of shoes? Should they have a warm winter coat? Should they be able to go out for a meal once a month with their family? Should they be able to get birthday presents? Should they have a mobile phone at the age of 12? And you ask these questions and they tip up to ones where you get more people saying, actually, that's a bit much. And then you work out what do the majority of the population say most children should have, how many don't have that, should they have a holiday once a year? A third of children don't have a holiday once a year. And that sets your poverty level. We can't run the poverty survey in the USA and haven't been able for decades because a large number of people in the USA say children should only have what their parents can afford and don't have a sense that this is wrong.
So that was quite a shocker as well, that point in the USA. What he said was they can't run that survey in the USA because in the USA they think that children should only have what their parents can afford. Yes. That's the end of it.
Yes, that is chilling, isn't it?
It's quite shocking, wasn't it?
It is shocking.
Another one that struck me was about you need to care.
I went to Oslo and I was in a place similar to this, as big as this, except there were babies. That's different. There may be a baby, it's very quiet, but there were babies in the audience. This is 10, 15 years ago. Normal to have babies. And I made a stupid mistake of saying, congratulations on achieving the lowest rate of child poverty in the world. And there were these shouts saying, how dare you say that? Our rate's terrible. It's really bad. Don't you understand how bad it is? And that's why they had the lowest rate of child poverty in the world, right? Because they care. The most important thing is to care. Once you stop caring, then things can get really, really bad. There's a danger in England that we're not caring about the health service because 1 in 10 people can, and every year 1 in 10 adults is paying for private healthcare. And when you get to a point when your ruling group doesn't need the NHS anymore, you are really in danger of losing it. So that's the key thing, is caring. But the way for politicians who want to do things that aren't helpful to win is to get you to stop caring about the stuff that matters and get you to get transfixed about something else. And the really bad ones start wars, just so that, that diverts attention. And that it's not all as Machiavellian as that. But if you believe that people are inherently unequal and that you are very clever and that most people are just there to labour, then you spend your political life lying to the electorate to get their vote. And that is part of our political history. And it would be great if we can get out of that. And other countries in Europe have got out of that. People really do respect each other as human beings that are all pretty able and equal, and not the idea that there's a small class of brilliant people who require 50, 60 or 70,000 pounds a year spent on their education because they have such wonderful brains they need to be made into prime ministers.
It was a bit of a waste of 60 or 70,000 pounds to put Boris Johnson into one of those posh schools, wasn't it? Although he did get to be prime minister. Good example.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the next one I had, I think this perhaps came after when we were talking about climate change and how, and it all ties in with this idea, if you've got politicians directing your attention where they want it to go, which isn't necessarily where it would be good for us to go.
The great news is that the efficiency of solar panels is increasing, the cost is going down. The danger is that there is a lobby from the fossil fuel industry that's incredibly clever at managing to find ways to get politicians in certain parts of the world to carry on supporting what's left of their industries. Reform are going to use petrol prices. You almost see it in their planning. They're going to try and go for the kind of protests of, we will come in and we will take down the cost of petrol so that you can drive as much as you want for as cheaply as you want, because you shouldn't have to. Right? Our roads are full anyway. Increasing numbers of young people don't have a driving license or a car. We need a transport system, which means you don't have to drive. This isn't fantasy. For the last 30 to 40 years, the number of people driving in Japan has dropped every year. You don't need to drive in countries like that. I've been to China only twice in my life. I went a few years ago and I was shocked at how many cars there were and how big they were. Much bigger than the cars in Oxford. I went back in January this year and I was utterly shocked by the electric bikes everywhere. So you've gone in China from a country which famously everybody cycled in the past, to cars, to back to bikes again. But things can change really, really quickly.
It's interesting, that one. And I mean, I hadn't heard that was what Reform were going to major on, but it makes absolute sense when you think that 90% of their funding comes from fossil fuel companies.
From the point of view of a ploy, I was going to say a tactic, but it's just a ploy to get votes. You know, you can listen to it and think that will bring them votes.
Yes, people.
But actually it will also bring them, if it worked and they got in, it would also bring them huge headaches, because there's a lot of revenue comes from fuel tax, from other things. So, but then that's not what they're bothered about, is it? You kind of get, I mean, it's interesting listening to the clips, sort of having been there, because you're there yesterday, there was a certain excitement and, you know, it's just a great event. But listening to them with a bit more chance to kind of reflect on it, I'm kind of left kind of feeling there's a lot of things that were positive in what was talked about, no doubt about that. But there's also a lot of clips like that, and it leaves you feeling like politically you can be on a cliff edge. Maybe we're always on a cliff edge of sorts politically, because you never quite know who's going to get in next. But when you've got a party like Reform, which doesn't mind lying, and which is seemingly accumulating a lot of support, then it just makes it very clear that there's a cliff edge. And how do you step back from that?
Indeed. And that instance about the petrol, I mean, although, yes, there will be some people that will welcome it, and yes, it will give them issues in revenue terms, there's also the whole climate thing. You know, if we row back from believing that we need to tackle climate change and elect a government who, you know, what if they start outlawing electric cars? What if they start, you know, it's like
well, you and I will be in trouble then.
We will. Well, we still got our bikes. Oh no, you're not getting all these electric bikes. But you know, it is a glimpse into what horrible future it could be. And although maybe even a couple of years ago we'd have gone, yeah, that'll not happen. You just need to look at America and look at them rounding people up and troops in the streets, and you know, to realise.
Yeah, and gerrymandering electoral districts so that Trump doesn't get a huge defeat in, you know, in 2 years' time when the midterms are.
Anyway, the most exciting part of the whole talk was when one lady sitting very close to me asked a question.
Yes. She was good.
I think she was very good.
She was good.
So in this chamber, the folk we elect here, it's proportional representation. And it's kind of complicated, and it can be complicated trying to work out who to vote for the list vote. These are the Conservative front benches. They wouldn't win if it was first past the post. So I'm just wondering, how different would the results of your research for the UK be if Westminster, a very different kettle of fish if there'd been 25 years of proportional representation down in Westminster.
Well, I mean, it could have come in after 1918. 1918 was when, I mean, Europe was in uproar. But a lot of our early PR across Europe came in then. We always tend to think that changes will make a huge difference. Classically, extending the franchise, giving women a vote, and they never tend to be as big a change as you'd expect. So UK-wide, we're barely a democracy. First past the post is hardly democratic as a system. Hardly anybody gets what they vote for. Only a small minority of people get represented by the party that they actually voted for. Of course, we have a second chamber, which is unelected. We're the only other country apart from Iran that has clerics in our legislative chamber. We have the City of London represented with all kinds of devious things are going on down in London, which are incredibly backward. And mean that we don't get the kind of politics that you do get in those countries where child poverty is lower, people live longer, public transport works, housing quality is higher, and they have voting systems which are democratic. The least democratic country in the Western world is the United States, their voting system. And the connection between having better voting systems and getting better politics.
Great question, Marlene.
Great question.
What was it like standing up and asking the question in the front bench of the Tory?
Front bench standing up from Stephen Kerr's kind of mic in front of me. I don't know. I these days, I just suddenly I had my hand up. I mean, I was thinking about it. Was a little bit questioning, but when I put my hand up, hadn't actually framed the question at that point. So it was just as well that it was a few minutes after that before Liam MacArthur asked me to say, yeah, it was good actually. I thought, oh, I've asked a question in the Scottish Parliament.
In the Scottish Parliament, I know.
I know. It's yeah. It was good, and also and the question really was how it might have changed the kind of social patterns that he picks up in his research, how that might have changed. He didn't answer that, but his actual answer was just as good. And I was a bit surprised when he said that the least democratic country. It probably means in the Western world, but was America, because I thought he was going to say Britain, but that's quite interesting, isn't it? I'm not quite sure that I understand why that's the case.
Well, I think currently that might be the case when you've got the things that have been done by Trump and the Republicans to try and stay in control. And you mentioned a minute ago that thing about... Yeah.
Maybe it's because... the system over there now is exactly how it has always been. I mean, he hasn't actually changed the fundamentals of it. But it does make you realise that previous presidents had that power, like these executive orders that are apparently okay to do, but didn't use them or used them very carefully. He uses them to get what he wants. But then the other thing is he's got a House of Representatives and a Senate filled with Republicans who won't stand up to him.
Yeah,
that's the difference, isn't it?
He's also got huge amounts of funds and support and publicity coming from a small number of billionaires as well, which is not.
That's true. Although that's been the case for a long time. And I mean, every now and again you'll hear a more principled American politician, Republican or Democrat, who will say this isn't a good thing for our democracy. So I suppose, but it is true that is certainly the case now, and we need to be careful, very careful, not to let that.
But it isn't us.
Become stronger in Britain, but it's there to some extent.
Got that as well. The first past the post system kind of allows that to happen. In fact, this was kind of a follow-on from your question.
It's an utterly ridiculous system. It's dangerous because it wouldn't be that hard for reform to get a majority of seats. Because for somebody like me, all my life, how I vote has hardly mattered. The level of scepticism about voting is so high, Reform are able to put up candidates. They might not all be human beings or real people, but they did it. Rishi Sunak called the election early, I am sure, because he could see their rise in popularity, which is why he didn't wait to go. Labour only won the election in London because of Reform. Everybody knows this. The Labour vote was lower than it was in the election before. First past the post would allow Reform on just 35% of the vote to sweep in, or make a deal with Kemi if she's still there, or Jenrick, and don't stand against each other. And they're kind of almost guaranteed to get it. That's the danger. If don't want to depress you, but if they weren't, then thankfully they're bumbling fools, who do things like see some people rowing around the coast and call the Coast Guard, and it turns out it's a set of former squaddies raising money for charity. Thankfully Reform MPs do fall out with each other. But thankfully the Conservative Party is not such a clever machine that it can work out what to do. But we're going to rely, if you don't like that politics, we're going to have to rely with first past the post on the inability of the Conservatives and the bumbliness of Reform and the Mayfair men behind them not to end up with the most right-wing government in Europe.
Interesting that our last guest that we interviewed also made that point about buying elections, and there should be limits on political spending.
Yeah, and if it applies to Britain as a whole, it ought to apply to Scotland and Wales, Northern Ireland as well. Yeah.
The bit about political disconnect and how you, as well as needing people to care, you also need them to be angry about the situation and how it's our fault that we're in this situation, really.
We don't have an anger about it. And I suspect that's partly why we've ended up in this current situation. If you go back to the period in the 30s and 40s where we really changed the curve from being a very, very unequal country with a terrible record on health in the 1930s to being a country that largely eradicated poverty by the 50s and did all these things, there were politicians who were extremely angry. The famous one is Aneurin Bevan for the health service, who lost his siblings who died as children because they couldn't see the doctor. And if you don't have that kind of anger in your politics as well to drive you forward, there's a danger that you get. Our health secretary for a long time, at the period where we were ignoring health inequalities, was Jeremy Hunt. He's the son of an admiral who thought it was really hard to live on an income of below £100,000 a year. Right? He was just disconnected from society. His company, Hot Courses, which makes money out of your fear about where do I do masters in the world, had made him a multi-millionaire. He grew up estranged from society. He has no idea, and we end up with him as health secretary as our infant mortality rises. Yeah, and it's not Jeremy Hunt's fault. We should never have put somebody in that position who knew so little about what he was doing. And it may sound a bit mean, but don't blame the ignorant politicians like George Osborne. Blame us for how on earth did we put somebody like George Osborne, Magdalen College, Oxford. How do you put somebody whose life experience is so poor that he can do the things that he did into that position of power? And rather than be angry with them and angry with the bad politicians, like Nigel Farage, we should be angry with ourselves for letting it be possible that they could have these positions of power and then make the mistakes that they've done.
Well, that's quite a call to action, really, isn't it?
Yeah. There was a question about did the effect of taking lead out of the water supply, was that part of why violence levels decreased? I must admit, I heard that question, I went, what? However,
Yes,
he answered it. He didn't. Bonnie Dorling did not raise his eyebrows. He just answered it.
For those who don't know, we in the UK and most of Europe have tried to get rid of lead in our pipes, in children's toys. The younger people here are largely lead-free. You're very, very lucky. In the USA, they still have lead. Lead is not good for your brain, and it's a poison. We had a rise in violence. Well, murder is the ultimate way in which we count it. A rise in violence to around about the year 2000. And I wrote papers with criminologists on this, looking at where was the rise. It was in the poorest areas. Who were committing the murders? It was largely young men who were poor. They were largely murdering their friends. In half of the cases, stereotype, they were drunk. If you're murdered, you are rarely murdered by a stranger. You're often murdered by somebody who really likes you, who loves you. The shock is seeing it going down. Now, there was a lobby of people who wanted to claim that the murder rate and violence in general was going up because we got rid of the death penalty at the end of the 60s. People do not think I won't have a fight just in case I hit somebody too hard and they die because of the death penalty. And the fact the murder rate went down shows that that's not the case. It's certainly good to get rid of the lead, but my gut feeling, without any evidence about why we got less violent and why people in a lot of countries, particularly in Europe, got less violent, and it's men, much, much more violent than women. Same curve everywhere, fascinating curve of men and women peaking around about 19, 20, 21 and then going down, but in some countries being 10 times less violent than in others, but always this pattern. And here's my bias, and you can see, because of my mother, I think it's a change in the mums. I think as the position of women changed over the decades, from my grandmother's time when you were essentially subhuman, you only just got the vote, you don't speak, through to my mum's 1970s generation of battling women, bringing up little boys like me and my 3 brothers and telling us not to hit. We were still, and we measured this, we had the most violent playgrounds in Europe, in the UK. I had to fight as a child. More and more assertive women and mothers, and the idea that this is just not how you behave. I used to be, this is not a proud, I was the second hardest in the 3rd year, if that means anything. Okay? But sadly, second highest in the 3rd year also means I was probably a bully. I was big. The change in our attitudes to violence, that it's something that is impressive at all, I think it's more that than the lead. Certainly good to get rid of the lead. Certainly violence levels are higher in the USA. But it's the society and what society tolerates. And ridiculous things like letting people have guns.
I think I just do want to say that this was a really, really good event. It was a really enjoyable event, and I felt quite I just sort of felt quite uplifted by it. Now, I know it was partly fun and being there, and then there's a few folk, and we kept finding ourselves waving to people at the other side of the chamber because we kind of knew them. But it wasn't that. Actually, what he said was also. You can hear from the clips that some of it's very hard hitting what he says at times, but I think what happens is that Danny Dorling's humanity comes through when he speaks, yes. And he doesn't hold back from what the statistics are telling him, and and he does have examples. He doesn't hold back from that, but his humanity comes back, and there was other things that we haven't particularly kind of put into the clips where he talked about his mum and everything that his mum and his mum's pals did, setting up. He sort of said, well, in a way, it's just little things, but that generation, they got out and they were at home with a kid and they wanted some company. So what did they do? They hired us the church hall. They put out a bit of advertising, all on bits of paper that they probably wrote themselves, and they set up toddlers groups. Yes, it was for the toddlers, but it was mainly for the women. So, and he talks quite a lot of that, and there is that, isn't it? And I think his humanity kind of comes through when he speaks, and it's interesting just thinking that right just now, because I think that enables him to be quite hard hitting because he has all the range of facts to back up what he says. But the way he says it, it just engages people, and he's always communicating, look, this is how it is. Here's the reasons why. It could be better. We could make more of ourselves, get engaged. So I think that's, if you've been listening to it and you're thinking, oh, that was a bit, there was a load of quite hard things to take in there. Yes, that's true. But he, as a communicator, is always saying, let's work out how we could solve this. Let's work out how to do it better. And that's what I really appreciated about the event.
Absolutely. And he did, he often said, it can change quickly. Other countries have done it. This is all you have to do. This is where we need to change. Here's a country that's doing it. So I thought it was positive. I mean, you're right. Just listening to them, there is some stark stuff in there. But like you, I came out of there uplifted.
Being in an event with Professor Danny Dorling, and how good it was.
Excellent, absolutely excellent. And just you could have heard a pin drop when he was talking. Everybody was intent, and all very, very relevant stuff. Some really good questions from the audience. Lovely to see so many young people, school.
Yeah, a couple of school parties.
Yeah. And even a tiny baby in there, maybe a
future, was very quiet.
Future First Minister, perhaps. But my hackles go up, as they always do, when somebody talks about this country and they mean the UK. And although he was acknowledging there are certain things that Scotland's doing better than England, and he made the point, that isn't good enough just to do that. That's a minimum we should be aiming for. Countries in Scandinavia in particular, but all over the world, that are doing much better than us, that we could be aspiring to do. And the thing he said was, it's because they've chosen to do it and because they care. Now, surely that must apply to Scots as well.
People have to care. They might even have to be angry, but they have to care, and they've got to turn up and do things.
Yeah.
And that's the way you get things done.
And you need to get angry.
You need to get angry, and you certainly need to turn up enough and care enough to vote.
We did turn up at the bookstall hoping to get a book to get him to sign, but unfortunately when we got there they'd all been sold out.
Yeah, because we got chatting
to other people. So there's another lesson for you. Decide what you want to do and go and do that first.
Yeah.
Anyway, now we're on the trail for lunch.
Coffee.
Bye. Thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to make sure you're following us and subscribe to us, then you get notified every time we put something new out, so you don't miss anything. That would be great. Also, you can click the little bell if you're watching on YouTube.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website, and we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.